Welcome, sleepy dreamer, to another quiet journey through the myths of old. Tonight we travel across the seas of ancient Greece, past the cliffs of legend, and into the shadows of a forgotten island, where a woman with serpents for hair waits in silence. Her name is Medusa. But who was she before the curse? Why did she live so far from the world? And what truth hides behind the tale we've all been told? Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let's uncover the soft, sorrowful story of why Medusa lived alone on a distant island. Before she was feared, before her name echoed like a warning through the marble halls of Greek myth, Medusa was simply a girl, a mortal girl, rare among legends filled with gods, demigods, and creatures born of divine chaos. And yet, it was her humanity that made her shine. She lived in the city of Athens, the heart of wisdom and civilization, where temples reached toward the sky, and prayers were whispered to gods carved in cold stone. Among these sacred places was the grand temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, war, and purity. And it was there that Medusa served, not as a warrior or priestess, but as a humble acolyte, tending to the fires, cleaning the altars, and offering quiet devotion beneath the watchful eyes of marble statues. Medusa was known not only for her striking beauty, but for the gentleness of her spirit. Her hair shimmered like woven sunlight. Her eyes held a calm depth that made even the most distracted soul pause. She was graceful in her movements and careful in her duties, always treating sacred objects with reverence. To some, it seemed the gods must have favoured her. For how else could a mere mortal possess such radiance? But Medusa's beauty was not a gift. It was a burden waiting to reveal itself. Many who came to the temple did not come to worship. They came to see her. Whispers echoed in the streets of the golden-haired girl who moved like a spirit and glowed like the dawn. Even noblemen and messengers would linger longer than necessary, pretending to pray as their eyes followed her across the polished marble floors. Medusa, ever modest, tried to ignore the attention. She wore simple robes, kept her head bowed, and offered only the gentlest words when spoken to. But still, the world saw her beauty as a prize rather than a reflection of inner light. She began to feel a shadow creeping into her days, a strange discomfort as though the gods themselves were watching her, not with love, but with suspicion. Yet, she remained faithful to Athena. The goddess was everything she admired. Wise, powerful, untouchable. Medusa longed to be seen not for her face but for her devotion. And so, each day she cleaned the temple steps, lit the sacred lamps, and laid offerings of lavender and olive oil at the statue's feet. Some say Medusa once prayed to Athena for protection, asking the goddess to shield her from the eyes of men and the dangers of the world. Others say she dared to ask for beauty eternal, hoping to keep her youth in service to the goddess forever. But whatever her prayer truly was, it would not be answered in the way she hoped. What Medusa could not see, what no mortal could see, was the tension building high above her on Mount Olympus. For in a world ruled by jealous gods, beauty was not a blessing, it was a threat. One day, a ripple passed through the heavens. Poseidon, god of the sea, had noticed Medusa. He, like the others, saw her not as a soul, but as a treasure to be claimed. His desire set the course of Medusa's fate, and neither her innocence nor her devotion could protect her from what was to come. But that moment, before the fall, before the curse, was a moment of light, a fleeting peace, a time when Medusa was just a girl, doing her best in a sacred place, unaware that the world was about to rewrite her name into legend and into sorrow. High above the mortal world, where clouds curled like silver serpents and stars whispered the secrets of eternity, the gods watched. They watched everything, cities rising and falling, kings making promises they could never keep, and mortals who dared to live as if the divine were not breathing down their necks. But sometimes, what caught the eye of the gods was not war or glory. It was something far more dangerous, it was beauty. Poseidon, lord of the sea, was not a quiet god. His moods rose and fell like the tides, one day calm, the next storming. He had ruled the oceans since time began, hurling waves against ships and whispering to the creatures of the deep. Yet for all his power, his hunger was not satisfied by dominion over the water. Poseidon craved admiration, submission, and often possession. It is said that Poseidon could not ignore Medusa. Her beauty did not merely please him, it stirred something deeper, more primal. He was not the first god to look upon a mortal woman with desire, and he would not be the last, but there was something different in the way he watched her. She moved with quiet grace through Athena's temple, her golden hair catching the flicker of oil lamps, her voice as soft as waves lapping against the shore. She was untouched, sacred, out of reach, and that is precisely what made her irresistible. In Olympus, beauty was currency, and power twisted love into possession. Gods did not ask, they took. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, was known for her pride and her cold judgment. Her temple was to be pure, unmarred by desire or defilement. She expected loyalty not only in worship but in spirit. Those who served her were to be untouched by romantic entanglements. Celibacy was not just preferred, it was law. To Poseidon, this made the Temple of Athena the perfect stage for a defiance, not just a seduction of a mortal woman, but a challenge to the goddess herself, a chance to violate not only Medusa's body, but Athena's pride. Gods did not war with swords. They waged battles through mortals, through gestures of dominance and symbols of insult. And so he came. One evening, when the sun had slipped behind the hills, and the temple stood quiet under the veil of twilight, Poseidon entered. Not with thunder or waves crashing at his heels, but with the silent authority of a god who knows no limits. No one saw him arrive. The acolytes had gone. Only Medusa remained, sweeping the stone floors and humming a hymn to Athena as night crept in. She turned, and there he was, tall, commanding, glowing faintly with sea spray and divinity. His eyes held the wildness of the ocean and the arrogance of someone who had never been denied anything. Medusa froze, unsure whether to bow or run. She felt the air grow heavy. The silence between them was not holy. It was dangerous. The stories differ here, as myths often do. Some say Poseidon spoke gently, tried to woo her with words and promises of glory beneath the waves. Others say there were no words, only force, only fear. But the truth that runs through every version is this. It happened inside Athena's temple. The sanctity was broken, the silence of the gods shattered, and Medusa, she was not spared. The goddess she served did not descend in a burst of light to save her. There were no golden shields or divine protections. There was only stone and fear and the echo of something lost. When it was over, Poseidon vanished as suddenly as he came, leaving Medusa alone among the shadows of the sacred walls, defiled, shamed, and with her prayers lying in ruins at her feet. Above, the gods watched, but none wept for her. In their eyes, a mortal girl could never be a victim. She could only be a symbol of disobedience, of impurity, of disrespect. And Athena, whose pride had been wounded not by Medusa's actions but by the violation of her temple, turned her gaze downward, not with compassion, but with fury. Medusa had become a vessel for divine jealousy, a scapegoat for the endless tensions between the immortals. She was no longer a girl. She was now a problem to be punished. And the curse had already begun to stir. Medusa had not yet seen her reflection, but when she did, the world would never see her the same way again. The temple was silent, but it was no longer sacred. Its marble columns still reached toward the heavens, its altar still smelled faintly of burnt incense and olive oil. But the air had changed. Where once there was peace, there now hung a weight, a tension that could not be named, only felt. The silence of that night wrapped itself around Medusa like a shroud, pressing in on her from every corner of the temple she had so lovingly served. She did not speak. She did not cry. She moved slowly, numbly, like a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. What had happened was not something she could explain, not even to herself. Poseidon was gone. His footsteps had left no mark, his breath no warmth. And yet, the sacred space had been desecrated. The invisible boundary between mortal and divine had been shattered, and she had been the unwilling fulcrum of that collapse. Medusa had spent her life honouring Athena. Every prayer, every offering, every whispered hymn was given in complete devotion. But now she stood in the goddess's house stained by a moment she did not choose. Her presence alone was a reminder of what had occurred, and in the mythic world of ancient Greece shame was a living force, one that clung to the victim, not the violator. She waited. Perhaps, she hoped, the goddess would appear. Perhaps Athena would comfort her, restore the purity of her sanctuary, remind her that the gods saw all and understood. But no light descended, no hand reached down. Instead, the temple began to grow colder, as though even the stone itself had turned its back on her. And then the judgment came. Athena did not come in person. She did not thunder from the sky or send a dove with a message of mercy. Her response was not the compassionate gaze of a protector. It was the cold reckoning of a deity whose pride had been wounded. In the divine order, mortals were not cherished. They were pawns, instruments through which gods played out their jealousies, grudges, and wars. To Athena it did not matter that Medusa had not invited Poseidon's attention. It did not matter that she had been loyal, faithful, pure of heart. What mattered was that her temple had been violated. Her name had been dishonoured, and someone had to pay. That someone was Medusa. The punishment was swift and merciless. With a thought, Athena twisted the girl's beauty into something monstrous. Her golden hair became a tangle of living snakes, their tongues flicking at the air with every breath. Her soft eyes, once filled with compassion and wonder, became cursed. Anyone who looked into them would turn instantly to stone. Her skin grew pale as ash. Her voice became a whisper that carried the weight of the grave. She was no longer allowed to walk among others, no longer fit to serve in any temple. The world that had once praised her now fled from her in terror. Where once she was adored, now she was feared. She had become, in the eyes of the world, a monster. But was she? That is the question that lingers, quiet and unresolved, like a breeze through forgotten ruins. What is a monster truly? Is it a being with fangs and scales? Or is it someone who reminds the powerful of their failures? Medusa was not cursed because she was evil. She was cursed because she became a symbol of something the gods did not want to see. Their own cruelty, their own flaws, their own injustice. And so the narrative shifted. No longer was Medusa spoken of as a victim. The poets began to describe her as a creature of horror, a villain to be vanquished. The fact that her gaze turned men to stone became a warning against female rage, rather than a shield against male violence. Myths have a way of twisting truth to protect the powerful, and in this case, it suited the gods to let the world believe that Medusa deserved her fate. No temples were built in her honour. No songs were sung to grieve her transformation. Instead, she was driven from the world, exiled to a lonely island far from the places she once knew, where her only company would be the statues of those who came to kill her and failed. But even there, deep in exile, the memory of that night, the night the sacred was broken and the wrong person was blamed, never left her. Medusa, once a servant of the gods, had been made into a cautionary tale, but not for the reasons the world believed, not because she was dangerous, but because she had been wronged, and no one came to save her. Medusa had barely begun to comprehend what had happened to her when the second wave of devastation struck, not at the hands of Poseidon, but from the one she had trusted most. Athena's punishment was not delivered with thunder or flames. It came silently, like a cold wind crawling down your spine. One moment, Medusa stood alone, broken in the heart of a defiled temple, and the next, the world began to twist. The first thing she noticed was her breath, still but sharper now, hissing softly around her. Her hair, which once gleamed like woven gold, began to stir unnaturally even though there was no wind. A prickling sensation bloomed across her scalp. She reached up with trembling fingers, expecting to find the silky strands she had brushed so carefully each morning. Instead, something alive coiled around her wrist. Snakes. At first she thought it was a hallucination, a product of grief and divine shock. But the weight was real. The writhing was constant. Dozens of serpents had emerged from her head, growing where her hair once flowed, moving with a mind of their own. They twisted and snapped and hissed at the air, and worst of all, they seemed to share her pain. She screamed, but the sound barely reached her own ears. Her voice had become unfamiliar, rough, laced with something primal. Her skin felt heavier, colder, as if the warmth of human life was retreating with each breath. Panic rose in her throat like bile. She rushed to a shallow pool in the temple's courtyard to look at herself, and that was the final cruelty. The reflection that stared back was not Medusa. Her once soft features had hardened into a severe, otherworldly mask. Her lips were pale and cracked. Her eyes, those gentle sea-glass eyes that had once drawn admiration, were now sharp, glowing faintly like coals in a dying fire. There was no kindness in them anymore, only power, terrifying, unwanted power. But that was not all. As she looked into her own gaze, a frog on the edge of the pool, caught in her reflection, suddenly stiffened. It made no sound, only turned grey, then crumbled to dust. Medusa gasped and backed away, but it was too late. The truth was already clear. Her eyes now turned living things to stone. It was not just her appearance that had changed, it was her very essence. She had been transformed into a weapon, a living curse. She was no longer allowed to be touched, to be loved, or even to be looked at. The simplest connection, a glance, was now a death sentence. And why? Not because she had betrayed her vows, not because she had sinned, but because she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught between the ego of a sea god and the fury of a goddess who refused to be embarrassed by a mortal's misfortune. Athena's wrath had nothing to do with justice. It had everything to do with pride. The goddess of wisdom had once been known for her logic, her impartiality, her dedication to reason. But even wisdom, in the hands of the divine, can be twisted. And when the sacred space of her temple was violated, Athena did not strike the one who committed the act. She punished the one who bore the mark of it. In the divine hierarchy, a mortal woman, even one as devout and beautiful as Medusa, was expendable. This was not protection. This was erasure. With her new form came exile. The temple that had once been her home could no longer contain her. She could not live among people. No community could withstand her gaze. Wherever she walked, fear followed. Birds froze mid-flight. Small animals stiffened and fell like statues. Even the trees seemed to lean away from her. And so Athena cast her out, not just from the temple, but from the world. She was sent across the sea to a remote windswept island called Sarpedon, a place where no ships dared to dock and no travellers passed by. It was a wilderness of jagged cliffs, howling winds, and silence. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe, but swallows. Here, Medusa lived. Not by choice, but by force. Not in peace, but in grief. Each day was a battle with her reflection, which she avoided at all costs. Each night she lay among the stones, unable to forget the life she had once known, the girl who prayed to Athena, who smiled at dawn, who believed in the goodness of the gods. That girl was gone. In her place was a creature the world would one day call a monster. But Medusa knew the truth. She was not born a monster. She was made into one. By jealousy, by divine rage, by a culture that blamed women for the violence done to them, and still the snakes wept with her in the night. The island to which Medusa was banished was not drawn on maps. It had no ports, no cities, no roads, only wind and rock and sea. It was a place the world forgot, and perhaps that was the point. Sarpedon, lonely, rugged and shrouded in mist, sat far beyond the known boundaries of human travel. Its jagged cliffs pierced the sky like broken teeth, and the waves below crashed violently, as if the sea itself were angry to be near such sorrow. No birds sang here, no flowers bloomed. The trees were gnarled and twisted by centuries of storms. Time did not pass the same way here. It lingered, stalled, echoed. This was the prison chosen for Medusa. When she arrived, she did not cry. Her tears had already run dry on the journey from who she had been to what she had become. The boat that brought her there had no crew. It moved as if guided by invisible hands, drifting across a moonlit sea, eerie and silent. When it reached the shore, it simply stopped, waiting for her to step off, then vanished, swallowed by the fog. There would be no return. She walked the coastline, feeling the earth crunch beneath her feet. The beach was made not of sand, but of fine white powder, bones of sea creatures and broken shells that had been ground down by ages of wind. She wrapped her robe tighter around her, though no cloth could shield her from the emptiness that surrounded her. This place had been carved by the gods not for peace, but for isolation. There were caves here, black and deep, where no sun reached. Medusa chose one as her shelter. It was a hollowed cavern high in the cliffs, facing the sea. From its entrance she could watch the horizon, where the ocean met the sky, endless and unreachable. She spent hours each day doing just that, watching, hoping, not for rescue, not for forgiveness, but perhaps for a sign that someone still remembered her name. But none came. Instead, her companions were shadows and silence. The snakes that adorned her head had become part of her, and she no longer feared them. They moved with her emotions, calm when she was quiet, restless when she remembered what had been done to her. They curled around her shoulders like living thoughts, hissing when strangers approached. Not that many did. But over time, they came. Men, warriors, hunters of glory. Stories of a woman with a cursed gaze had spread across the world like wildfire. Not the truth, not the tale of betrayal and divine cruelty, but the version the gods allowed to survive. Medusa, the monster. Medusa, the deadly. Medusa, the horror on the cliff. And so, brave fools came in search of her, hoping to slay her, hoping to bring her head back as a trophy. They believed it would earn them honor. None of them listened. None of them spoke. They came with swords drawn and shields raised, and one by one they turned to stone. The first time it happened, Medusa wept. She pleaded with him to stop, to turn away. She warned him with trembling hands and tears in her voice. But he advanced, sword gleaming, pride burning in his eyes. And then he was stone. A perfect statue caught mid-strike, his face still twisted with determination. She screamed for hours afterward, the snakes in her hair shrieking with her. She smashed the statue in a fury of grief, hoping to undo what had happened. But the pieces remained, cold, still, silent. After that she stopped warning them. More came, and she learned to live among the statues. Some she arranged like companions, seated around the edges of her cave like silent watchers. Others she left where they fell, broken and scattered across the cliffs, as if the island itself had grown a forest of stone men. Each new visitor only deepened her solitude. Their presence was a cruel reminder of how the world saw her, not as a woman, not as a soul, but as a test, a challenge, a beast to be conquered. She wondered if any of them knew her name. Medusa spent countless years on that island. She walked barefoot along the ridges, felt the sting of rain on her skin, listened to the wind howl like a wounded animal. At night she dreamed, not of her old life, but of strange things. Oceans of glass, wings made of snakes, a voice she could not name calling her to rise, to reclaim something lost. She began to speak to herself aloud, to the snakes, to the stones, to the moon. She was not insane. She was alone. And there is a difference. Loneliness does not break a person all at once. It erodes them, slowly, softly, like water wearing down the sharp edges of a stone. But not all things erode to dust. Some harden. Some become monuments. And Medusa, in her sorrow, became something the gods had not expected. She became strong, not in body, not in vengeance, but in soul. She stopped cursing her reflection. She stopped praying for the gods to take back their punishment. Instead, she sat each morning at the edge of her cave, looking out across the water, and she breathed. Her gaze, which once brought her shame, became her shield. Her snakes, once a symbol of her violation, became her crown. She was not beautiful in the way the poets had once praised. She was not pure in the way the priest demanded. She was not silent in the way the world preferred. She was something older, something true. She had become what the gods feared most, a woman they could not control. There were no clocks on the island, no bells, no hourglasses, no voices to mark the turning of days. Time unfolded in the rhythm of wind and wave, in the slow bloom of moss on stone, in the changing patterns of the stars above Medusa's cave. But even in this forgotten place, this sanctuary of sorrow and exile, she felt the passing of time deep in her bones. The silence was not the gentle kind that soothes the soul. It was heavy, watching. It settled over the island like a veil, pressing against her skin, as if the very air mourned something that had been lost. Only the hissing of her serpents broke it. They whispered constantly, speaking to her in a language beyond words. They flicked their tongues at the wind and hissed at the memory of gods, as if they too resented the heavens. Medusa no longer feared their sound. Over time they became an extension of herself, expressing what she no longer said aloud. In their motion they carried her sorrow. In their stillness, her moments of fragile peace. Some would curl gently around her face when she wept. Others coiled protectively when the distant echoes of ships stirred across the sea, reminding her that the world still existed. Without her, she lived among statues, and not just any statues, men frozen in the last moments of rage or fear, swords raised or shields lifted, faces twisted in expressions they would carry for eternity. Each one had arrived believing the stories, believing the lies the bards sang in taverns, believing that slaying her would earn them a place among legends. But they never paused to wonder why she was there, why she was hidden away, why her eyes held such unbearable sadness. They came with steel, and they left in silence. At first she couldn't bear to look at them. They were reminders of how the world continued to misunderstand her. So she stayed in her cave, curling into herself, letting darkness wrap her like a shroud. But the statues did not vanish. They multiplied, and slowly, strangely, they became her companions. She began to speak to them, not because she expected an answer, but because there was no one else. She would sit among them, naming the ones whose faces she could bear to look at. "You are brave," she would say to one, touching the cold curve of a stone cheek, "but bravery doesn't mean justice." To another, with softer eyes frozen wide, she whispered, "Did they send you? Or did you come on your own? Did they promise you glory? I hope they remember your name, even if they never knew mine." Sometimes she imagined their lives before they came to her island. Did they have families? Were they forced to come by kings or by pride? Did they believe they were doing something noble? She didn't know, and the silence gave no answers. What the world called her curse was not just the power to turn living things to stone. It was the weight of being forever misunderstood, to be seen only as danger, never as a person, to have no voice in one's own story. But slowly, quietly, something changed within her. She no longer flinched at the sound of her own footsteps echoing through the cliffs. She no longer avoided the polished surface of rainwater pools or the shine of obsidian rocks. When she saw herself, she did not turn away. Her reflection had become something else, something not quite mortal, not quite divine. Her gaze no longer frightened her. It fascinated her. She was no longer afraid of what she was becoming. The island had not broken her. It had refined her. Like stone under constant rain, she had been worn into something sharper. The island had long since accepted her presence. Where once it seemed to resist her, with its sharp winds, its hostile cliffs, its aching silence, now it simply was. The waves crashed with the same rhythm each day. The sky wore the same shade of grey. No seasons passed here in any meaningful way. Time dissolved into sameness, and within that sameness, Medusa lived. She no longer feared the snakes that writhed gently on her scalp. They were as much a part of her as breath or heartbeat. Sometimes she forgot they weren't hair, until one hissed at a bird circling too close, or when they coiled protectively at the sound of footsteps on the stone. But there were fewer of those sounds now. Over time, the number of intruders had dwindled. The world had learned at last to be afraid of her. In the early years, men came often, armed with mirrored shields and sharp blades, with stories of heroism on their lips and ambition in their hearts. They came not to understand her, not to speak, not even to listen. They came to end her, to use her, to raise her severed head like a trophy and return to their cities adorned in the illusion of victory. She had begged the first ones, she had warned them, she had hidden from them. But they never heard her. They only looked, and in looking they were lost. Their bodies became stone, their expressions froze forever, surprise, fear, hatred, sometimes awe. A few statues knelt, not from reverence but because their legs buckled as the transformation took them. Their stone fingers clutched swords, or shields, or nothing at all. Some looked toward the horizon as if they had never truly seen her before their final moment. She stopped moving them after a while. At first she had tried to place them gently, respectfully, as if they might one day awaken. Later, she simply stepped around them. Their stillness became part of the landscape. The edges of the cliffs were littered with frozen bodies like shattered myths, faces no one would remember, names lost to wind. And in that strange garden of stone, Medusa wandered. She did not sleep much. When she did, her dreams were tangled things. Not nightmares, but half-memories twisted into impossible shapes. She would dream of the temple, but it was underwater, flooded by Poseidon's wrath. Or she would see her own reflection in the eyes of 1,000 birds, each one turning to stone mid-flight, falling silently into the sea. She missed her voice, not because it had vanished. She could still speak, and sometimes she did, whispering to the wind or humming the old hymns to Athena, but because there was no one to hear it. The silence around her was a hollow space that never echoed back. Even the snakes on her head grew quiet in those moments, as if mourning something neither of them could name. Sometimes she wondered what the world was saying about her now. Did they still speak of her as a monster? Had anyone questioned the story? Did anyone remember who she was before the curse, before the temple, before the gods reached down and turned her into a lesson for other women? She would never know. The ocean did not carry words, only salt. Her only visitors now were the sea winds, the occasional drifting feather, the gulls that circled high above and wisely never came close. Once, a fox wandered into the cave. It must have climbed across the rocks, searching for shelter. It paused in the entrance, blinking at her. Its gaze met hers, only briefly, and it froze. She turned away quickly, but it was too late. Another statue. She buried that one. She couldn't bear to leave it on the stone like the others. In time, she began to sculpt. Her hands, once trained to prepare sacred offerings, now shaped stone. With tools she carved from the bones of shipwrecked wood and fallen swords, she began to create. Not images of the gods, as she would never carve Athena's face, but animals, flowers, memories. A grove of stone olive trees slowly grew near her cave, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky. She carved doves and lions and faces she remembered from her childhood. A woman who sold figs in the market, her younger sister, a laughing child. A statue of herself, not as she was now, but as she had been, smiling, head lifted toward the sun. Each sculpture took weeks, sometimes months. She gave them names. She spoke to them, and though they did not answer, they listened in the only way the world could anymore, with stillness. The silence of the island no longer haunted her. It had become her companion, her cocoon, her teacher. It asked nothing of her. It did not shame her. It did not judge. In the quiet, she found something she never had before, a kind of truth. The world had always demanded something from her. As a maiden, she was expected to be beautiful and obedient. As a victim, she was expected to be silent and invisible. And as a monster, she was expected to be feared and destroyed. But the island, the silence, asked for nothing. It allowed her for the first time simply to be. And in that being, in that stillness, she discovered a strange form of healing. It was not forgiveness, it was not forgetting, but it was freedom. No one told her who she was anymore. No one touched her without her permission. No one could. She was alone. Utterly, deeply alone. But she was not powerless. Not anymore. Her gaze still turned flesh to stone, but it was no longer a curse. It was her boundary, her armour, her choice. And within the whispering winds and the endless sea, Medusa lived. Not as a monster, not as a woman ruined by the gods, but as something they never intended her to become. Untouchable, unbroken, and utterly her own. One morning the sea was still. Not silent as it had been for years, but truly still, as if holding its breath. No waves broke against the rocks. No mist rolled in from the horizon. Even the wind, once a constant companion, had gone quiet. The island was waiting. Medusa sensed it before she opened her eyes. The snakes stirred uneasily, their tongues flicking at the motionless air. Something was coming. She rose and stepped outside her cave. The sky was pale, colourless. The sea looked like glass. And far off in the distance, so far it almost seemed like a dream, there was a glimmer. A flash of metal catching the morning light. A sail. Someone had found her island again. She watched without moving. Her hands, once afraid, remained steady. She had no illusions left. Whoever came would not seek her counsel. They would not ask her story. They would arrive as all the others had, brave, proud, and utterly unprepared. But this time was different. He came alone. A single figure stepped ashore, his armour too polished, his shield gleaming unnaturally. He walked with purpose, not hesitantly like others, but as if following a prophecy. Medusa watched him approach the cliff path, saw the careful steps, the calm gaze. He did not flinch at the statues scattered along the way. Frozen men, stone wolves, the shattered remains of would-be heroes. This one was no fool. She turned her back and went inside, waiting in the shadows of her cave. When he entered, she could hear the breath he tried to steady, but there was no fear in it, just discipline, resolve. In his hand he held something wrapped in silk, something shining faintly beneath the fabric, and on his arm the mirrored shield of Athena, Perseus. He did not speak. He did not try to reason with her. He simply stood at the edge of the cave and raised the shield to reflect her gaze. She saw herself in it, barely. Just a flicker of her face, the snakes rising like smoke around her temples. And in that flicker, the curse activated. She felt the old magic reach outward, strike the polished bronze surface and turn back toward her. For the first time in all her years on the island, she felt her body slow. Her limbs chilled, her skin stiffened. The stone crept over her hands like frost, and her breath caught in her throat. But there was no fear. She looked into the reflection calmly, even as the stone rose to her chest, her shoulders, her jaw. Her final thought was not a scream, not a prayer. It was peace. Her heart, wounded for so long, had nothing more to protect. She had made peace with who she was long before this moment arrived. There was no hatred in her anymore, no rage, only stillness. And then, there was nothing. Medusa became a statue, not twisted in agony, not monstrous, beautiful, a calm, regal expression etched forever into stone, a quiet strength preserved in marble, as if she had finally escaped the myth the gods had forced upon her. Perseus stepped forward. He did not look at her directly. He did not speak. He moved with the precision of someone fulfilling a task given by forces older than himself. He took out a blade, curved and silver, and severed her head with practiced ease. He wrapped it carefully, gently, in the same silk he'd brought ashore. He did not linger, and when he left, he did not look back. He carried her with him. Not just her power, but the symbol of her. The severed head of Medusa would become a weapon, used to strike down monsters, to win wars, to shield gods and men from harm. The stories would call him a hero. They would not tell of the woman he killed. They would not mention that she was alone, that she had been exiled, that she had once lit candles in a temple and sang to the goddess who betrayed her. They would not say that her only crime was being seen. Her name would be repeated in whispers, carved into statues, etched onto pottery, but not as a person, as a warning. Medusa, the monster, the cursed, the head of serpents and stone. But on that island, her legacy remained. The stone garden stood still, untouched. Her sculptures remained. The olive trees of marble, the animals frozen in grace, the statue of herself as a girl, hands raised to the sky, smiling softly. The wind eventually returned. It wandered through the cliffs and caressed the surface of the sea. And when the sun set each evening, it cast golden light across the statues, so that, just for a moment, the island glowed. And somewhere in the vast memory of the world a deeper story waited, not of a monster, but of a woman who was wronged, a woman who endured, and a woman who, though they tried to silence her, was never truly forgotten.